So my talk is based on practical problems. So at Pipedrive, we are migrating to Kubernetes cluster now. So if somebody remember, I was like huge swarm embracer and talked about it, and everybody else are, nah, we are using Kubernetes, and some people said you should use Kubernetes instead without any actual arguments why. So this year we did research, we compared several alternatives additionally, just to be a safe side, but Kubernetes is the best. So now we have a talk how we approached with the same self-service delegation, but engineers have access to Kubernetes clusters and not only infrastructure administrators. And of course, we used Okta, and I'm going to talk about some interesting things about Okta as well. And just as a note, if you have a chance to use cloud provider Kubernetes, manage Kubernetes, do it. It's so much easier. I was so jealous, but some quest said, I'm using Amazon EKS, I'm using my Amazon cloud, I'm using Google Kubernetes, I'm using my Google Cloud, and I'm like, what time I'm going to use it? So I'm going to talk about it with you, what we use. So my background, my ancient background comes from financial services. I used to be big guru of LDAP. I had several projects with single sign-on using our NTLM. I hope nobody uses anymore. Maybe some ancient things still do. My favorite single sign-on technology, Kerberos, because Linux and Java supported that. And if it wasn't enough or secure enough, when we previously we used smart card authentication as well. So just a quick question: who has some kind of LDAP directory services installed? All right. So another question: who uses something else when Active Directory? A couple. So. Well, I'm not a big Microsoft fan, but I think Active Directory is actually best directory services on web product as a side note. So based on my experience, my background, I Googled Kubernetes and LDAP because that's what I knew. First thing I noticed on back then was like Red Hat OpenShift, and I was like, no, we are not Red Hat customers, unfortunately, or luckily, it doesn't apply for me. I knew the Docker Enterprise had a LDAP integration, but I still looked further. And if you don't want to buy Red Hat or Docker Enterprise, if you haven't heard about it, Docker sold its enterprise product yesterday, hot news. When you have chance to use Rancher instead. But if you don't like Rancher or can't use it and you want to use vanilla Kubernetes, you need to use something else. And let's talk about the very basic things to get everybody on board. So what is authentication? So authentication in my mind and in general means that you prove yourself who you are. So for example, very practical use case, you are on the border, you show your passport, you are authenticated. So, and I want to mention single factor versus multi-factor. So I hope everybody has like Google or GitHub account has multi-factor enabled. Who doesn't? Okay. Enable it. You are the only one. All right. We're gonna hack you. So multi-factor means that you need several authentication methods to prove who you are. So additionally, for your username and password, most commonly you need to get additional one-time password from your mobile phone. Or if you use Android applications, then Google has very fancy way how to do a multi-factor authentication for you. Or you get SMS. Or you, I don't know, use DNA if you are very security focused. But so what the authentication options are? How to prove yourself who you are? So funnily, Kubernetes supports anonymous requests. It's not enabled by default, but I even don't know good use cases for it. So don't enable it. Another approach is to use certificates, but with certificates, the issue is that they are valid quite a long time. Most people issue certificates like 1 year or something, or maybe more. And so the expiration long is very, very long. If you don't have experience with public infrastructures, I don't recommend to use those either. Then there are some static tokens. Either you configure yourself in files, either token file or password file. Maybe for your use case it makes sense. In general, it's the management overhead if you have to manage like 300 or 1,000 tokens. Or if you use service account, especially for the deploying stuff, then your CI/CD account, you create the user, give some kind of access, and then tokens makes sense in that case, but not for end users. So if you still need like LDAP integration, then you probably should use either external solutions using proxy. So proxy authenticates with your LDAP credentials and sends the header to API. Or alternative is API server sends the information to external service using webhooks to authenticate over there. But sometimes if you use managed service provider, you can't control API server. Previous methods, and including the next one, OpenID, requires you have control over API server in Kubernetes. And then there is a workaround. If you don't want to use your Amazon credentials to authenticate users to EKS cluster, you can impersonate. So you create a user like a troubleshooter maybe, and me as a Renno act behalf on troubleshooter user to do some stuff. This is the impersonation. There is very cool video in the internet as well. And I have a lot of slides for OpenID Connect tokens and Okta. I'm gonna skip it this one for a moment. Let's talk about authorization. So authorization means you are granted to do what you want to do. So if we go back to the border example, you showed your passport, you are authenticated. When if that country requires visa, then if you have visa in your passport, it means you are authorized. So you can step over the border and go and do some sightseeing. So same approach with Kubernetes. There are various authorization mechanisms. Very special one, but usually you can't use it, or maybe you can. Kubernetes is open, you can do pretty much everything. There is a node authorization, which is mostly meant, or mainly meant for the kubelets, so the agent on the Kubernetes node. Alternatively, again, if we talked about webhooks for authentication, you can use external service. And it means you send all the information Kubernetes knows. Maybe you want to access ports, you know who is the user, it's authenticated, and the external user service says that yes, that is totally fine thing to do. Or another very advanced attribute-based access control, you can go really crazy and very creative how you create those access policies using attributes. But the downside is they are considered quite complex. So if you go to internet, mostly you hear about the role-based access control. And with in minimal what the roles are, so you have roles which are specific for namespaces or limited to your namespaces, if you know Kubernetes namespaces, or it's a cluster wide. And again, you configure what kind of resources you want to access, maybe bots, you want to get the list of the bots, or you want to access the secrets. So if you have roles defined before it is actually you are authorized to do, you have to map. So in that context, it means binding. So either namespace binding, or you have a binding which authorize access to cluster wide. And pretty much those bindings or YAML files are quite identical. Well, you define when kind role binding or cluster role binding, and depending if you have a namespace or not, gives you access. So you want to map access to some user or some group. In Pipedrive, we decided that mapping access roles to groups is most convenient way to manage and control it, because we use step configuration management. We bootstrap cluster once, we create those role bindings, and those groups are externally managed outside Kubernetes. So that's where Okta comes in our case. All right, now my promise. I promised to talk about more about OpenID Connect, and it's what it is. It's a authentication and authorization protocol built on top of HTTP, and it's widely used in web services. So, for example, if you want to use let all your Facebook friends access your Kubernetes cluster, Facebook, you can integrate your Kubernetes cluster with Facebook. Although I have never seen that has happened, but most common use cases, if you do it your pet project, use as a software engineer, use Google or GitHub account. If in case of Pipedrive or some other enterprises, then Okta identity provider is used, because we can enable two-factor authentication there, manage groups, and control access to other applications. If you don't want to use any cloud service as well, then I can give you a shortcut. Use some text or Keycloak identity provider project, which you can deploy yourself and manage identity provider there. Text is actually so cool that you can use LDAP as a backend identity provider, including Keycloak. So what's all that fuss about it? So we need to send some kind of token, and OpenID Connect is all about JSON Web Tokens. And what the JSON Web Token does, it is very cryptic string. Actually, this is the actual value. It's sent over HTTP headers, and you can use JWT translator, and it's in three parts. First one tells which algorithm is used. I hope it's signing, I'm not correct. But the most interesting part for me is the middle one. So you can configure what kind of data to send. So in case of Pipedrive, we send email data, but you can also send the user first name and last name if you think it's necessary, or control that email is actually verified. And as I mentioned about groups, this is the crucial information. I want to have it present in JWT token, so that I don't have to manually configure a Kubernetes cluster, so that authorization information is included in JWT. So how to get that JWT token? So if you use any OpenID Connect identity provider, then by default authorization flow is configured or is supported. And what happens is, so user get authenticated, you get authorization code, which is very short-lived, and authorization code is used to query from token endpoint, identity token, and access token. And if you remember previous slide, this is the ID token is the one that I'm interested. So if you use any Google or GitHub, that's the flow that they support out of the box. With Okta has various other alternatives more. Just the next slide. So what's the downside? Even with Okta, it works very well, but the problem is that I couldn't get any group information using the authorization flow. So if I wanted to get groups, then I had to deploy their custom authorization server, which is additional cost of money. So we asked how much they cost, and we, based on that response, we were looking further. Maybe we can get it cheaper or something. Anyway, so alternative is to use implicit flow. And I really don't know the details why this OpenID Connect specification supports different use cases. But the main idea is that you get authenticated and you immediately get an ID token. You don't have any authorization token in the middle, and you don't get access token, which has some additional information about you. But with Okta default setup, groups were included, and it was like win-win. Now we know how to get the JWT token and how we use it. So we deploy Kubernetes Dashboard in a Kubernetes cluster. And by default, Kubernetes Dashboard, maybe you have already seen it, has the authentication for like this. So you can upload your kubeconfig file, or you can insert the token manually. But for me, because I know a single sign-on is very convenient way to authenticate, I wanted to actually bypass this. And Kubernetes Dashboard is quite smart. So if you send the authorization header with the JWT token, it authenticates you automatically. So I'm gonna do a small demo. If somebody comes to hold my microphone, great. Georgi is my best buddy here. We do Kubernetes together here. So applause to him. Yes, we hold it. Right. All right. So I'm gonna open incognito window, and I'm gonna go to one of our test clusters. And what happens? Oh my God! It asks for credentials. So now it asks additional verification. I need to figure out where I set my phone. I'll be back. So closer. So here it is, my phone. I have an application, just, and it asks me, is it me or not? And I press yes, and look, no hands. Oh my God, haven't received. Wait, it's working. So you can see now we got access without any manual interception using Google Dashboard. Only thing is that what I don't like is that you actually don't see your username here, but that's the small thing. Right, thank you. So be close. So, all right, one more demonstration and before the theory. Maybe you don't want to use Kubernetes Dashboard at all. You are a fan of terminal and you love kubectl or kubecontrol or kubectl. I like to say kubectl. If I'm angry with Kubernetes, I say kubectl. So actually, kubectl has the OpenID Connect authentication support enabled. So all you have to provide is the token and refresh token, and it will use refresh token if your token has expired to re-authenticate. But in our case, it wasn't possible to use because we have two-factor authentication enabled. And alternatively, as we wanted to use implicit flow, refresh tokens are not supported there. So using kubelogging, and kubelogging can be used various providers like Google and GitHub or with text. So I'm gonna show how on terminal it works. So Georgi, can you come back? Let's zoom it up. Is it visible for you? Yes. All right. So first, I'm gonna make sure that my cache is deleted. Otherwise, it is due. And now I just want to get the bots. And what happens? Look, the browser was open, but because my Okta session is valid here, that says okay. So let's go back, and you see I got the access to my bots. And if I rerun that program again, or this command again, it doesn't authenticate because the token is valid for 1 hour. And where is the token? It's in my secret folder, Q, gas, and here it is. So that's the secret nasty thing. And what does it do? So if you really want to see what it means, so here it is. Here is my username. I'm part of some Kubernetes groups, and that's how I got access here. Thank you, Georgi. All right. I have no idea what my time is. So we managed to get on-premise Kubernetes clusters, authentication with multi-factor. We have single sign-on workflow enabled for our dashboard. Our sessions are short-lived, so the token is valid for 1 hour, and we manage the roles outside Kubernetes. And I hope those slides are somewhere shared, so if you are more interested, then this is all the resources I have used to get those slides ready. So now I'm ready for questions.
Hey. Thanks for the great presentation, Renno. I have a technical question for you to warm up. What's the kind of maximum limit of GVT token? How much data can you push into it?
That's a good question. So I don't have a hard answer for it. There is a recommendation that if you embed groups into a JVT token, you should filter groups that are needed. 8, what?
Yeah, thank you.
8 kilobytes is the answer. So yes, the main thing is that if you use Okta or something else and you add groups information, you should control the list of it. Don't put everything there.
Well, I have one. Okay. Thanks for the presentation. Maybe it's a little bit out of the scope of the presentation, but you mentioned OpenID Connect. Could you tell us a little bit about the difference between authentication authorization, because sometimes it's not very clear, and when should you use OpenID Connect and when is OAuth 2, for example, enough?
So in case of Kubernetes or in general?
In general, if you have anything to say about that.
So yes, that is very good question, and I could talk quite a lot about it, because OpenID Connect is the extension of OAuth 2 protocol, and OAuth 2 protocol can be used to authorize your request on behalf. For example, in the early version of LinkedIn, if you wanted to add get the contacts, your Google emails into LinkedIn, then LinkedIn actually asked your username and password for a Google account. And you never know if they used those credentials to fetch your emails as well, additionally for contacts. So you can use OAuth 2 to authorize to only get access to your Google contacts without credentials. So that's one use case. But I don't want to talk too much about it.
All right, fair enough. Any other questions?
Behind you.
Just here, right? Yeah, so first of all, thank you. That was really insightful. But the question is, would the same approach work for a managed Kubernetes, like for example, EKS for Google?
So yes, I already mentioned the ones. So if you have managed Kubernetes, then and you want to use some other authentication method, then you have to use user impersonation. So it means that you create some users with default access rights, and you have some additional proxy, so that you as, well, me as a Renno, and I want to access or act like a deployer account in Kubernetes cluster, which is deployed in EKS. Because yes, all those authentication and authorization methods require to reconfiguration of API server.
Thank you.
Hello. Do Kubernetes support SAML 2.0?
So if you use some product like Rancher, yes, you can use SAML, or Docker Enterprise has a SAML support, and probably opens it as well, as SAML is also very hot authentication and authorization mechanism. So, but the vanilla Kubernetes doesn't support it.
Thank you.
All right, there is one behind. Throw it.
Yes. Do you hear me? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to ask how do you invalidate these GVT tokens, or you provide it, like when you authenticate, then it's a very short period when they are active, or how this is done?
So OpenID Connect, at least from Okta side, it's valid for 1 hour, and it can't be configured. So in general, it means that time has to pass 1 hour, or in worst case, we could change Kube API server configuration to use new account from Okta, so it doesn't trust the existing tokens.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Renno.